You are listening to Panther Tracks.
Because of the following special program, Wonder Woman and the Incredible Hulk will not be presented this evening.
It's time to get all your Star Wars news in a single file. This is Making Tracks. Here are your hosts, Mark Newbold and Mark Mulcaster.
That's not true. That's impossible.
You're listening to Making Tracks. This is episode 37. I'm your co-host Mark Newbold, and joining me today is a man who literally defies description. Mark, introduce yourself, please.
Well, you just said it. I defy description, so I'm lost. I don't even know what to say.
What can we say? I mean, if this was a video, it would all be there for us, but it isn't. We're rolling through the lockdown with loads and loads of news, and it's a particularly busy episode. Today, we're going to talk about the Temuera Morrison rumours, about him coming back into live-action Star Wars. We'll talk about Farthest From 22 and Rebelthon. There's all the great news about Taika Waititi coming on board a live-action Star Wars film, and how can we not talk about Disney Gallery and all the great things that Dave Filoni said? Where should we start, Mark? What would you like to talk about?
I think we should start with Mr. Fett, the hot topic at the moment.
It mega is. I mean, Hollywood Reporter put the news out, and late one evening, and everyone suddenly, the internet as it does, totally exploded. Half went left, half went right. Which camp are you in? I mean, there's different ways you can play this one. Tem's played more than one character.
He has played more than one character. I think it would be kind of cool if it was Fett, but also at the same time, there's a part of me that thinks that if they were going to hint at Fett, would they have done it slightly more obviously than just the Spurs kind of sound? Because I've been looking at the Gunslinger episode, trying to figure out actually if he's wearing the same costume or not, and it doesn't look like he's wearing the same footwear, at least. It doesn't seem to be the toe spikes.
Yeah.
I've not had a chance to actually take the episode and kind of run it through my kind of colour suite to see if I can kind of increase the brightness and get more out of the image, because that image was graded really dark, and I think that was one reason for doing it. It's clearly a tease to who, at this point, we don't necessarily know. Like you said, the more eagle-eared fans will possibly think it is Fett. It's not been confirmed by Lucasfilm,
no.
And that's always... So it's always harder to kind of like... know exactly when even with a Hollywood Reporter who have got a good track record, but when they just use that generic sources have confirmed or sources say, it makes it harder to have confidence in the news. If it is, it's great. I'm quite a Fett fan, and if it isn't and they do something even better or even more different, well then I'm totally open and up for that as well. What do you think?
I think, well, I mean, we talked about it before we started recording. Boba Fett's one of those characters that had very little screen time, but his legend of what he does and the way he carries himself and the work that he did as a bounty hunter is bigger than what you saw on the screen. So you could take people who look at it literally and go, well, he wasn't that big of a deal, was he? Look at, everything he did in Empire was overseen by Vader, and everything he did in Return of the Jedi was not the best representation of Boba
Just
Fett.
a fail.
Epic fail.
It's slightly funny, actually, when you look at how one of the key things with The Last Jedi was to set up this legend and legacy of Luke Skywalker.
Yeah.
And they tried so hard to do that. They did that also with some of the supporting books for the journey to The Last Jedi. Boba Fett has kind of done that organically, just by the very nature of who he is. I mean, like you say, I can remember... I was out in the USA, I think in like 94, 95 for the first time.
Yeah.
And I picked up the Boba Fett Dark Horse comics.
Yeah.
And I thought they were great. And there was such a kind of like mystique and uniqueness behind them.
I agree with that. I think his legend overtook the reality of what you saw on the screen, but I don't think that's a bad thing, because, you could argue Han Solo as a comparative character. Okay, you see way more of Han. He's more integral to the plot in the films, in a family way later on, as well as in a sort of a plot thing. Because in the original Star Wars, he doesn't come in for like the first 45 minutes. He's not a key player. You've met Luke, you've met Leia, you've met Obi-Wan, you've met Vader, you've met all the key players, and then Han Solo, kind of comes into the story in the cantina. Han Solo's the guy that's telling you, I'm the best pilot, I'm the best gunman, I'm the best smuggler. He's telling you everything. You don't really see him do that much smuggling. You see him pilot, so you know he's a good pilot, there's no doubt. And Solo, the film completely backs that up. He will tell you he's the best at this, that, and the other. Boba Fett is a man of few words, and I hope that's something that they stick to if and when he comes back. But I think one thing you can look at in terms of Boba Fett, is you've only got to look back to Attack of the Clones and realise he's a clone of his father, who, okay, a few tweaks, he ages differently and such, but he's a clone of Django. We saw Django take on a Jedi and get away in Obi-Wan and Kamino. Okay, things didn't end so well with Mace Windu, but of course you saw the Reek took his jetpack out, so he lost an option, a battle option straight away that he had against Obi-Wan. So you don't know how he would have done if his jetpack hadn't have failed. So you know Django's very capable. Logically, Boba Fett would be to that level. You kind of do know to a degree how good Boba Fett would be, but you didn't ever really see him in action on the screen. So, like you just said, all that Legends material, what we now call Legends material, all those Boba Fett comics, Bounty on Barcuda, all the stuff, all the little one-shots you got back in Dark Horse Presents, and then Tales of the Bounty Hunters and all that sort of stuff, Shadows of the Empire, all builds up this legend of Boba Fett. Fett now is looked at in the same way that a lot of the EU characters, a lot of the literary and comic characters were. Boba Fett almost feels like he's camped in with, okay, Thrawn's a bad example because now he's coming to canon with Rebels, but you know what I mean? Like he's kind of in that conversation with like Mara Jade and all these characters.
Yeah.
So I think people like us who've been following it since way early, Boba Fett is right up there. He's always top of the readers' polls, and like throughout the 90s, it was him and Mara Jade, wasn't it? And he's one of those characters. He's a top tier character for doing really on screen relatively little. I really want him to come back to see him kick ass big time to kind of rectify that in live action. So it'd be interesting to see how they play it.
Yeah, I think on one hand you could say that Boba Fett for the Mandalorian series is low-hanging fruit. Mm-hmm. It's something that's very easy to kind of like make that connection. And, let's not forget that Chapter 5, The Gunslinger, was set on Tatooine. So it's feasible he could have had such, bad injuries from, the Sarlacc, from him escaping the Sarlacc, that maybe he's actually had to spend quite a long time kind of recuperating, recuperating, and also then, maybe getting some armor. Yeah. There's also that option, as like you said, every single clone is from the same cast as Boba Fett. Yeah. Maybe it's not Boba Fett. Maybe it's a clone that has taken on the Boba Fett, Jango Fett kind of moniker and is just living out for twilight years as a bounty hunter. The clones have got to do something once they retire. Yeah. I don't imagine they get much of a pension from the Empire. Good point.
I mean, of course, he could come back as Boba. He could come back as Rex, and all the rumours of Rosario Dawson coming into The Mandalorian Season 2 as Ahsoka. If he does come back as Rex, there's a lot of logic in that. But of course, I literally last night, watched Revenge of the Sith on Sky Movies. I've not seen the film since The Siege of Mandalore, so it kind of did add another wrinkle to watching the film, which was really cool and worthwhile. But if Ahsoka does come into the storyline, and there is that angle, live action Ahsoka and other potential stuff going on from there. And Filoni kind of said it in a Deadline interview over the weekend, that you've seen the end of Rebels, you've seen the end of the Clone Wars, there won't be another season of Rebels, but there may be more with those characters. And of course now at the end of the Clone Wars, you kind of cast your mind forward to Rebels, which is already ended, so you cast your mind even further down the timeline to the end of Rebels with Ahsoka and Sabine, and you're thinking, well, is there stuff there? And you kind of know Rex is still around in the Rebels era, but this is another sort of 10 years on. But, there's loads of options. I'm excited for it. I think it could be fantastic if he does come into it.
Hi, I'm Toby Jetson, and you're listening to Panther Tracks.
Personally speaking, and I don't want to put you massively on the spot, how credible do you think this rumour is?
As soon as the rumour came out, and we're all in different chat groups and chat rooms and stuff on Facebook and socials, quite a few people came out and said, finally, I've known about this since January. And, so there was quite a few people I saw sort of, and they're all American-based and sort of California-based as well, so which is where they film it. But they weren't saying, yes, finally, to it being Boba Fett. They were going, yes, finally, to it being Temuera Morrison. And our very own Adam from Fanther Down Under, straight away, I got into a thread online saying I don't think it's unreasonable to think that Fett could make it through the Sarlacc explosion and all that stuff. That's quite more than feasible. You can chop Darth Maul in half. and people pull a face that Boba Fett's coming back, I think it's with his skills and armour, yeah, he would. He had an off day. It didn't kill him. But, canonically on screen, you saw him go into the mouth of the Sarlacc. Sarlacc burps, and there he goes. We know how big and deep a Sarlacc is it's like an iceberg, isn't it? You only see in the mouth, so it's a monstrous thing. I think Fett would have got out. And I think George had said way back when he thought Fett had got out, he just never got around to doing anything with it. So
yeah, that's right. Yeah, George said that, and he even said that like fairly recently in the last couple of years. Yeah. But then I suppose actually at this point in time, he doesn't own the company, and he can say whatever he likes. Really,
of course he can. I mean, we'll come back to that, won't we, when we talk about Disney Gallery and what Dave Filoni said? Because I mean, tying the two together, it's like. It seems pretty clear that, okay, George turning up on set, a few sound bites and nodding a wink and a point in the off camera to the left sort of thing makes it look like he's on set all the time, and he isn't. But he clearly, from what has been said, has conversations with Filoni. So you saying about him, okay, he's not involved and he's not in charge, which is true, of course, still a major Disney shareholder, so he has some sway. And
absolutely.
And I think if George ever sort of really felt passionately about a storyline or an aspect of it, especially now, sort of 7 or 8 years after he sold the company, which you kind of forget it's that long, I think they would respect that. If he was passionate, like, you are not showing Yoda's species. We never found out what species Yoda was from. We never went to his homeworld. We don't go there. Or maybe this is the story that they were saving it for. I just kind of think that they would pay some heed to that.
As you say, when you watch a gallery, there's so much respect from everybody around those 2 round tables for George and for what he created. It would be hard, I would imagine, for the creatives to kind of like go against maybe his wishes. But I suppose you have got that business and you have the other shareholders and you have what the company, like the overarching Disney company, may want. And if they've got something in mind and they're really pushing it, I suppose it will be that kind of like the meat of, the 2 different kind of perspectives, who has final say. I suppose ultimately that's what it comes down to. Who has the final say? And I suppose if the CEO for Disney kind of turns around and says, no, we need you to do this, then irrespective of George's wishes, they might have to do it. Who knows? I mean, you'd like to think that probably the creators in charge of Lucasfilm are clever enough and savvy enough to work around that kind of stuff and be diplomatic about things. But we've also seen in the past where George's wishes possibly weren't respected so much. So
that's true. Well, we've took a bit of a left turn in our conversation, and we've mentioned Disney Gallery. We might as well talk about it now. So Disney Gallery.
Why not?
First 2 episodes have come out. Episode 1 looking at directors. Episode 2 looking at legacy. Second episode reviews coming on the site very shortly. Episode 1 reviews already out there. I was blown away by it. It wasn't what I expected. The tone of it, the presentation of it, it was very cool in the sense that having Favreau lead the table, like he used to do a show that was on YouTube years ago called Table for Five. I don't know if you remember it. Very kind of similar. It's that brilliant show, and it was a similar kind of vibe to that. So it's a formula that works for him. That first episode, directors. Obviously, you've got all your lead directors from season 1 of The Mandalorian. They didn't skimp on letting you know how important to the process Filoni is and his knowledge and his sensibilities. And that kind of brings you to the second episode, Legacy, where you've got some of them around the table again. And Dave gives this phenomenal talk at the end of the episode about why the through line from Phantom Menace to Return of the Jedi works so beautifully. We don't need to go into that. People can listen to it and hear it for themselves. There's no way I could summarise, or you. We couldn't summarise what he said.
No.
We couldn't say it as well as he said it. There's no point. Yeah. But to know that he's got that view on Star Wars and that he comes directly from George, how does that make you feel as a fan more than anything else, knowing that he's tapped into this source, if you like? And like we've just said about the Temuera Morrison and the Boba Fett stuff, George still has influence.
Yeah. For me, as a Star Wars fan, it fills me with confidence, and it fills me with a certain level of kind of warmth that there is a voice in the company like Dave Filoni who is able to kind of say, well, this is what George said. This was George's take. Let's not forget that George himself was very much open to the whole sandbox idea of actually getting different directors and different creative voices into the Star Wars universe to play around with things. To be honest, I think the Favreau-Filoni team seems to work really well. There's a reverence without it being scared to maybe challenge the status quo, but at the same time, they're very respectful. I think that's what we need in Star Wars, really. And this is nothing to do with any commentary on, say, The Last Jedi or the sequel trilogy at all. But I think this is very much the kind of genesis for The Mandalorian, having these 5 different directors almost, and actually having like Bryce Dallas Howard, who hasn't really directed much, or Dave Filoni, who hasn't directed live action, getting these people into the mix and actually giving them the chance to carve out individual episodes that work as a kind of a whole story, but also have a different take on different genres per episode, is kind of what I think they possibly wanted to kind of do with the last 5 years of cinematic films.
Yeah.
But I think the stakes were too high and the pressure was too much, and it didn't quite work. On the scale of The Mandalorian, it's a much smaller scoped story that works really well.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a really good point. I mean, it seems to have worked. I mean, obviously, Taika, we'll talk about him in a minute, but Taika's experienced director, and Deborah Chow obviously just blew everyone's socks off coming from television where she did, to the point that she's directing season 1 of Kenobi. Rick Famuyiwa's coming back for season 2 of Mando, I believe. And so, it's worked with everybody doing what they've done. It makes me wonder, and this isn't a criticism, it's an observation, but it makes me wonder, looking back now, you bring JJ in to do Force Awakens, and he's a big name director. He's got Bad Robot behind him. He's a genre guy in that sense. And also, already at that point, he'd done Mission Impossible 3, proving he could pick up the Mission films and give them their own flavour and do what he did with them. He'd already done Star Trek, well, the first 2 Star Treks, proving he could pick up that franchise and do it well. And he'd done Super 8, which is basically a Spielberg film. So I think he was the right guy. He's got his own ideas and he's got his own style and feel and vibe, and he brings all the fandom he does from television, but he felt like the right guy. But obviously then you can get into the weeds about all the other directorial choices. Obviously Josh Trank came out last week and sort of talked about his project that didn't happen, and for various
the Boba
reasons.
Fett project, yeah.
Exactly, and that could be relevant to the conversation in many ways. Other than George being a writer-director in Star Wars, it is a difficult path to tread, because I do feel that Star Wars, of all the franchises, kind of does need the director directing in his lane, doing his thing, the producer producing in their lane, doing their thing, and the writers working collaboratively. And that's where the story group always felt like a great idea in terms of continuity and a sort of a through line of plot and just thoughts and ideas, and then working with a writer to formulate the story, and then bring the director in and make everything cohesive and work it as a team. But having a writer-director, it's almost like, well, this is my vision of Star Wars.
Yeah, it's a singular voice.
Absolutely,
yeah.
And it's like, unless it's George, and of course George is 76 this year, I think. If he hadn't have retired by now, he would have retired anyway. He's probably done with all of that, and he won't be around forever, because who is? In the same way that they've very successfully picked up other composers to do great music. John Powell, who personally, in my opinion, did the best Star Wars soundtrack since Phantom Menace with Solo, and Giacchino.
Michael Giacchino, yeah.
Absolutely, so they've done that. They've done it with the music, which is vitally important, but with directors, they've not quite nailed it. And I think because it's Star Wars, because it is kind of its own thing, you can't lump Star Wars in with Star Trek or other sci-fi. You can't lump Star Wars in with Willow and D&D and other fantasy and Game of Thrones.
Lord of the Rings, yeah.
It's its own thing. Star Wars, it's now 40 years in, is its own thing. So it does need that, hand steering the ship sort of thing. And I don't think giving it to writer-directors is the way to do it. It's not. It just feels like it's got to be more controlled than that in a good sense, in a creative sense, not in a hindrance.
You need somebody at the top, figuratively, shall we say.
A Kevin Feige character.
But I was trying to kind of make that comparison without bringing up Kevin Feige, because that's the obvious go-to kind of person. But I suppose it's that kind of similar voice. You kind of need somebody at the top who's able to kind of go, right, okay, well, this is where we're going. This is the through line for these characters. How they get from A to B to C, the actual story beats and stuff like that, it's going to be more down to the writers and the directors. I mean, it's curious, actually, because if you think about it, and I said this to somebody else the other day, who says, the worst thing that has happened for Star Wars is that Disney bought it off of George. I go, yeah, but let's be fair. If George still owned a company, possibly we would have had episode 7 and probably episode 8 by now, but we'd still be waiting for episode 9. Yeah. We wouldn't have had Rogue One. We wouldn't have had Solo. We probably wouldn't have had
Rebels or Resistance.
The Mandalorian. Yeah, Rebels or Resistance or The Mandalorian. Yeah. And also, controversially, and people sit on one side of the fence or the other, we wouldn't have had like the reclassification of expanded universe, which kind of was unfortunately sorely needed something to happen because it was just starting to trail on a little bit. Whereas we've had this opportunity to go back and to have new authors come in and write their stories for things that actually we thought as fans we may have known what's happened, but actually we've just had one take. I mean, when you talk about that, I can remember, I think it may have been Tim Fizan or Michael Stackpole kind of said, maybe it been like a San Diego Comic-Con panel a few years back, when you write for a franchise, when you're asked to write a Star Trek novel or a Star Wars novel, you know that you are writing and you're creating characters that aren't owned by you. Ultimately, their fate and what happens to them isn't actually down to the author. And I think almost that mentality needs to slightly happen with the films. And coming back to the gallery, like you said, you could see that George was on set and there was enough kind of footage of him that I think was probably done as a confidence buoyer. For the disenfranchised, for those who are like, oh, it's a Disney Star Wars live action series, it's going to be crap. And as soon as you see George holding like Baby Yoda, or you see just George on set, automatically makes people go, oh, okay, well, if he's on board, then I can at least watch this with an open mind.
Hi, this is Gareth Edwards, director of the best standalone Star Wars film since Caravan of Courage, called Rogue One. You're listening to Panther Tracks. Enjoy.
When the rumours came around before the sale happened, I remember talking to a bunch of, I won't name them because I don't want to break confidences, but talked to a bunch of people in the know who knew that he'd put it up for sale, but they didn't know who he was going to sell it to. And that, you know, there was like companies in China were being talked about, and then like NBC was being talked about, and companies like that, Universal was being talked about. But then the logical head says it's got to be Disney, isn't it? You know, the whole ABC connection with Young Indy and all the other stuff, and Star Tours and everything. So it's the right home in that sense. And I still think if George hadn't have sold it, like you just said, he was working on 7 anyway, and I think the original plan was to make 7, then sell it. But then Disney were like, no, we really like this, we want it now. And George was like, fine, okay. I mean, a lot of people say, and this is the polarising nature of social media, which we really shouldn't pay anywhere near as much attention to as we do.
Pay no attention.
None at all.
No attention.
It's just people shouting loudly in a glass box, really, isn't it? But Lucasfilm wouldn't have continued without Disney buying it. I personally call BS on that. I think Lucasfilm would have continued. You'd have had a lot less content. You wouldn't have had, like you just mentioned, all the shows and films that you just mentioned, most of them wouldn't have happened. You probably would have had a sequel. Well, Clone Wars would have finished it on its own back in 2013, 2014, and what we're seeing now would have been done 5 or 6 years ago at least. You would have probably had a sequel series, which may or may not have been Rebels. You probably wouldn't have had Resistance. You may well have had a live action show, but it wouldn't have been The Mandalorian. It probably would have been Underworld. So you would have had similar stuff but different because of the technology and the money coming down. I mean, Disney Gallery, when Kathleen Kennedy's at the table and says, you know, one thing that amazed me was that Lucasfilm and George have created, 126 patents?
Yeah, 126 patents.
Yeah, you know, and that's all for tech, and like they start reeling it off, all the different technological advances that Lucasfilm and Skywalker and everything else, and, you know, Sprocket Systems before Skywalker and the graphics group before Pixar and all the stuff they've done. Incredible stuff that George gets no credit for outside of the industry that works with this stuff every day. And you'll know, you work in the industry, there's stuff you use that's probably come from that lineage.
Oh, yeah, the whole of Sky edits on Avid.
Yeah.
And we've always edited. It's awesome. And just that in itself is kind of cool.
So, but I think I think what would have happened, this is way off into the weeds now, I think what would have happened is Lucasfilm would have probably remained an independent film company, but they would have had backers come in. There would have been some kind of funding source that would have come in. So there would have become more of a partnership rather than being bought, i.e. Marvel going completely into Disney and Pixar being bought by Disney. I think what would have happened is Lucasfilm would have continued as an independent company, but there would have been funding sources backing it, and that would have been borne out by, well, if NBC backs this series, then that show goes on NBC, and if somebody else backs this series, then that goes on to Netflix, or whatever it may be. That's the way I think it would have happened.
Yeah. I mean, although I think the problem that we would have had, it's probably still the vast cost that some of these TV series were, reportedly going to cost. And I don't think really, prior to Game of Thrones, a channel would be willing to put down that kind of money unless they knew it was certain it was going to do well.
Yeah.
And with Star Wars at the time, it wasn't going to be, a sure thing. The next series that was going to be released was Detours.
Yeah.
And that was, a complete departure from anything that we'd seen from Star Wars. And it was kind of satirical in its very nature.
Yeah.
And we had kind of seen that. We'd seen the Family Guy and we'd seen the Robot Chicken episodes. And so you kind of saw the shift from what Star Wars was to what they were thinking Star Wars was going to be in the future, something that they could, make light of and all that kind of stuff.
Good point.
I think, for instance, one of the reasons why they were able to make The Mandalorian look so amazing was because of the stagecraft technology.
Totally.
What we saw of it actually in those 2 episodes of The Gallery was actually, those sets looked massive on screen when we saw them in the final thing, but actually, like, some of those sets weren't very big.
No.
You just had that screen and bits and bobs. It was almost like if you were to kind of go back to 1999 or 2000, you could almost imagine that stagecraft screen would have just been blue screen.
Yeah.
And it probably would have looked something very similar to how they shot Attack of the Clones.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a really good point. And it, again, I mean, I don't know who owns the proprietary, the patent for stagecraft. I don't know who came up with that. It's not, doesn't matter. Our guys are using it first, and you kind of look at it and go, well, that totally is going to be how they do future, not only future Star Wars, but future television.
Yeah.
And it goes back to sort of 2007, 2008 when Lucas was talking about building the Grady Ranch and he had all the locals kicking off, and because he wanted to build a volume like Cameron did Avatar in a volume, but not a stagecraft volume. I mean, that is just something else. And Disney Gallery has really given us a great insight into how they're making this show, and we've still got 6 episodes to go, which I'm stoked about. I can't imagine what else we're going to see, and also I don't think anybody knew this was coming, so this was such a sweet surprise. Everybody's saying, as soon as Mandalorian episode 8 is on, and as soon as Clone Wars episode 12 is on, I'm cancelling my Disney Plus subscription. Well, more fool you, because it's worth it for this.
Yeah, I think so. There's a part of me that kind of watched these 2 episodes. I was kind of thinking, is this the equivalency of like the documentaries we get on the Blu-ray discs, on the bonus features? Because there's a part of me that thinks that we probably won't get a physical Blu-ray quote-unquote release of The Mandalorian.
Yeah.
And so this is kind of like your bonus extras.
Yes.
What they've done is they've obviously filmed this and they've kind of said, what, there's enough here, we can break this down into 8 differently themed episodes that will actually hold general audiences' interest, whereas put it on as a bonus disc on a Blu-ray, and it's only really people of a certain interest who will go to that.
Yeah.
Really, let's be fair. So I think that there was a certain behind-the-scenes feel that kind of made it feel really natural and authentic, which I really liked about it. And also that, it's going that little bit deeper into the production process. And for me, I'm all about the process. As somebody, obviously, like you said, who works in the industry and that, I'm always curious as to how different production companies and different creatives approach projects. So anything that I can see and anything I can learn about the creative process is always going to be fascinating to me.
Hello, this is Sam Whitwer, and you are listening to Fantha Tracks.
Last weekend, the weekend of May the 4th, Farthest From 22 changed from being a physical let's get together in the room and spend lots of money event down in Fordingbridge in the New Forest to an online event, and Dave Tree and his team pulled together conversations, games and quizzes and panels and talks, all sorts of wonderful stuff. We were both involved. Did you enjoy yourself, Mark? Because I certainly did.
I had fun. It was great. It was really good. And I think there's a uniqueness behind what Dave offers anyway. I always appreciate getting down to Farthest From and all the stuff that I tend to do with Dave when he invites the Rebel Legion and the UK Garrison along to his events. It was nice. And I think also, you had to put some serious thought into actually kind of creating some really engaging content that was going to run for that period of time. And I think he pulled it off really well.
Yeah, it's tough. It's tougher than you think, and he pulled it around and turned it around in sort of 2 or 3 weeks. I don't think it was even that long. We had the opportunity to catch up with a couple of guests. We spoke to Brian Herring and we spoke to Anthony Daniels. Here's a couple of minutes of me and Anthony Daniels talking at Farthest From 22 live.
Is it like muscle memory? Because we talked about this before, all the pinch points and such makes the posture the way it was. But when you're out of the costume, inherently, do you kind of know where the bite point is for the elbows and such?
Yeah, it is muscle memory. As with rehearsing to pick something up, say the binders in that same in that control room. At one point, Mark says, hand me the binders. Now, the only way I could pick them up was to have rehearsed before we were shooting to know where my elbow and my hand had to be, because I'm flying blind there. I'm not. It looks like I can see them but I can't. So muscle memory is really important. And, after a period of time, you get used to it.
I suppose your spatial awareness goes, doesn't it, when you're looking through pinpricks?
Spatial awareness, sense of perspective, sense of location, it all goes. No peripheral vision means that if you're standing next to me, normally I'd be able to see peripherally, but with 3PO, next time you see a horse with blinkers on, it's me. Yeah. Not literally, I don't play horses, but so I have to know somebody who's there in order to clock them directly. Otherwise, 3PO would spend the whole time like a blind person feeling for where people are.
We also had the chance to talk to Brian Herring about his time as BB-8, but also about his interests as a collector. But just to have a little bit of a different conversation was really cool.
I think it was really nice to be able to tie kind of both interviews into the whole vintage thing. I mean, Anthony did that whole kind of show and tell with his props and that, which of course is really fascinating because we know where they've come from. Yeah. Especially for me, who's, and I don't mean to rub it in, I promise, a little bit younger than both you and Brian. It's always fascinating listening to how people reacted to Star Wars when they first saw it in the cinema, and also, that first initial wave of merchandise that people started to buy and, you guys played with and stuff. I got mine later on because I got mine kind of like second hand from the neighbours' kids who had kind of grown out of Star Wars, and my mum was just like, oh, well, we'll have it. At that point, it was still kind of like, these are just toys. But it's really nice to listen back to the fond memories of, like, of what Brian says and what you say, Matt. So it was a nice, fun interview.
It's fun. I'm not insulted at all. I don't think of you as being younger than me. I'm far from it.
I'm not. No, not really.
No, it was good fun. It was really good fun. And also for people who listen to Making Tracks, we recorded an exclusive mini episode of Making Tracks that you can only hear on the Farthest From feed. So if you want to hear us rabbit on about Star Wars for half an hour, that's the place you need to go. It's a special episode that you can only get there.
Hey man, it's me, Kevin Smith, Star Wars fan, Fantha Tracks fan.
Now, as well as that, you were involved in another event that was happening that weekend, Rebelthon.
Yes, that's right. The Rebelthon took place on the same weekend as Farthest From. This was a charity fundraiser. As I think you may have heard my Legion Commanding Officer come on a couple of weeks ago and kind of explain it all. This was kind of in the similar kind of vein to the earlier 1980s kind of telethons that you used to get out, more in the States. But we did have some over here. And I suppose we still do, really. We still get like Children in Need and that. And that was exact and comic relief. And both of those were pretty much telethons, really. I can remember, actually, you had banks of celebrities kind of sat there with really big, chunky phones and, taking donations from the public and all that. But yeah, so this was kind of like a slightly different kind of take. This was kind of like, an online kind of convention. At the same time, we were raising money for UNICEF throughout the whole feed. And that feed, I think, went on for about 14 or 16 hours in the end. It was meant to be 12, but we got so many different guests from cast and crew from the Star Wars productions that we just kept on kind of like expanding it. We had people like Vanessa Marshall drop in. I spoke to Garrick Hagan in a pre-recorded interview, which was fun and really fascinating. But what was great was, we raised over $11,000 for UNICEF, which is just great, and again, put together in a really short period of time, I believe. So both Farthest From and the Rebelthon just shows kind of like the ingenuity and the creative thinking from Star Wars fans in the Star Wars community, how to overcome the problems we have with lockdown at the moment, which I think is very positive and very heartwarming, and just kind of something that I think we should all be proud of going into the future.
Absolutely, yeah. It feels like right now that these online events is the immediate future for fandom, isn't it? This is how we're going to consume our events and our big reveals, and we're probably not going to be all getting together in a room anytime soon, but we shall only make it sweeter when we do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can't wait for that to happen. But at the same time, I think it's great that actually the access to having so many cast and crew members has never been easier.
Yeah.
Because of like the likes of Zoom and FaceTime and House Party and all these other different social media apps. And we've got to remember that actually, a lot of these cast and crew members are, men and women who are basically sat in their home locked down, as well. So therefore they love the opportunity to engage with fans and talk to fans about stuff. And and some of those conversations on the Rebelthon yeah, sure, they touched on Star Wars, but also they just went off in all different directions. And, we spent a lot of time talking about, how the lockdown is affecting everyone. So I think it was quite a positive thing for them as well, not only for us to kind of raise the money, but just for them to be able to engage with the fans.
Hot dang! This is Darth Elvis from Darth Elvis and Imperials. I'm proud to be a part of the Family Tracks family, and let me tell you, make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel, follow us on Facebook and on Twitter, Instagram, and check out the website, FantaTracks.com, baby.
So the final episode of the first season of The Mandalorian was directed by Taika Waititi, who a lot of people will know from Jojo Rabbit, Oscar nominated, and from Thor Ragnarok, which is probably my favourite Marvel film. And now the news has come that he will be taking the helm of a live-action Star Wars movie at some point in the future. I'm buzzed about it because I think he's hilarious and I like what he does on screen. How do you feel about that one, Mark?
When I first saw Thor Ragnarok, I kind of wasn't sold on the whole change in creative direction with regards to the character, but I'm literally actually, because of lockdown now, about 2 films away from having done the whole Marvel Cinematic Universe in order.
Oh, wicked.
Which is quite fun. In retrospect, I kind of do feel like actually that was a good pivot for the character. But, Marvel to one side, I thought Jojo Rabbit, it had a lot of heart and a lot of soul to something that was quite a slightly dark and kind of black comedy kind of feel to it. And I mean, it just worked really well. And I think, maybe if you had said to me back when 2017, when after Ragnarok had come out, this chap's going to possibly write and direct a Star Wars film or what have you, I would be a little bit more kind of I'm not too sure about that, because I think the tone might not be quite right. But actually, I think the fit is possibly going to be about right. And obviously, having seen what he's been able to do on The Mandalorian, I'm not anything but excited for it.
Absolutely the same. I think he's got a slightly left of centre skew-F vibe about what he does, which I loved about Ragnarok. I like Ragnarok because visually it had that Guardians of the Galaxy feel about it. And I've said before, I think if I wasn't a Star Wars fan, as deeply into Star Wars as I am, other fandoms that I would get into, I'd be nuts about Harry Potter. I'd always be a Trek fan. I love my indie. But Guardians of the Galaxy felt like the best, fresh, new thing that's come along in an absolute age. And I love both of the films. So Ragnarok kind of had that multicolour, vibrant, sort of busy Mobius feel about it, which I loved. And it was just busy and so many things going on. But it had that great... Colourful, exactly. And it had that great sense of humour. And, it had a wry sense of humour and slightly, just a bit... I mean, you say about Thor, it's funny, I watched Age of Ultron again the other day, which is, I think, quite an underrated Marvel entry. Mm-hmm. And I didn't realise how funny Thor is in Age of Ultron. It's quite funny going back and seeing it, having not seen it for a good long while. There's things wrong with that film. There's things that don't quite flow right. James Spader's phenomenal. He could read the phone book. He's got one of those voices. But and Ultron's a great character, and he always was in the comics. But to see Thor, I'd forgotten how funny he is in Ultron, and that only gets escalated massively by the time you get to Ragnarok, which I think, if I remember, kind of takes place around about the same time as Civil War. So, it was just really cool to see that element. And I'm a Hitchhikers fan, and Hitchhikers is by nature a bit sort of Monty Python, a bit sort of weird and sort of surrealist, and
it's irreverent.
Mega irreverent, like completely irreverent. And so to see or to think that he's going to bring elements of that, and we might be underselling. He might just want to do it a straight down the line Star Wars action film, and very much within the. And this is a whole nother conversation of, do you want Star Wars to have a template? Going back to what Filoni said about the thread from Phantom to Return of the Jedi was beautiful. But one thing you don't want is to box in what Star Wars can be. So, which is why I did a review on the site the other day of John Hicks, who does our roleplay stuff. Years ago when I was doing Lightsaber, did a review of Tales from Jabba's Palace. But he reviewed all 3 of the short story books in one review, and I wanted to break them into their own individual reviews. Well, he said the least about Tales from Jabba's Palace, so I went back and sort of flicked through the book and found some sort of notes on it online and kind of refreshed my memory on the book, because I didn't have time to read the whole thing again, and remembered enough that I could write a sort of a second part of the review. And one of the things I put in there was, it was nice with Star Wars that you can do these great big galactic mega stories like the Skywalker saga, but you can also tell these small one-on-one sort of 2-player stories as well, and it's still Star Wars, just as Star Wars as anything else. I dream of the day that somebody does a live action Star Wars episode set in a bar with just 2 characters sitting at the bar talking, because I think it could be fascinating if they did it right. You know, you could do with these double headers. It doesn't have to be about hero's journey all the time, and you know, and all these sort of things that people keep tagging these tenets onto Star Wars that constrict it. And I think the thing about Star Wars is you want to open it up to all these different possibilities of storytelling. So I think Taika coming in with a weird, that's what Hassel, I think he might do it just like looking at it from the sideways on instead of straight on. I think it could be brilliant.
I think if we were to take a step back, I think Taika would have possibly have been great director to have done the Solo movies.
Oh yeah, that's a good call. Yeah,
just because I think you kind of get that. I mean, because there was a couple of points in Ragnarok that I was like, they're literally right on the cusp of breaking like the fourth wall. Yeah. But they don't, because they do like the gag when he's in the cage, and you think he's kind of talking to the audience, but he's just talking to some skeletons and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I think that's a great way of just kind of like pushing that fourth wall so it starts to bend a little bit, but it doesn't actually break. And I think actually that would be quite fun. I mean, obviously sometimes, and we've commented about, say, for instance, Last Jedi, sometimes the humour in that was a little bit too self-aware. So that's possibly a risk. But again, from the way he spoke in the gallery, from the 2 episodes we've seen, he's very respectful of what Star Wars is, and I think also what Star Wars means to people as well.
Again, it's the difference. And that's why I'm enjoying that gallery thing so much. You said it earlier. Everyone at that table respects Star Wars and respects what George laid out. And I think Taika went into that a little bit, didn't he? You know, he sort of talked about it. I mean, Filoni, everyone's talking about what Dave said, but Dave's been inside baseball for 15 years now. He worked for Lucasfilm of old, and he's now working for Disney. And there is a difference, isn't it? Disney Lucasfilm is a part of the Disney machine, and so it is a different system. But his lineage and his sort of thread comes from those days. It's the difference between somebody wanting to tell a Star Wars story in the Star Wars world, respecting how that works, and then wanting to come in and tell their story in Star Wars and change what Star Wars is. And obviously you've got to have change, and you look through all of the 9 movies and what we knew in, okay, I suppose you look at it in the order it was made. So you look at Star Wars and then you look at Empire, and Kirshner brings different things in, and it expands. And then Marquand, who gets nowhere near as much respect as he should for Jedi, he expands it more. But also the filmic way of shooting it. George went and did different things on the prequels, and the directors on the sequel trilogy have done different things again. And it's like, it's all part of the language and it expands it. But you want somebody to come in and tell a Star Wars story whilst respecting the feel and the vibe of Star Wars, but not being constricted by it. I think you can have certain parameters that if you stray outside of it, it doesn't feel like a Star Wars film anymore. But that's not constraining. That's like, you've got all this space within that to tell an amazing Star Wars story that you can riff off this and talk about that. And you just said something I hope that it comes true at some point and may turn out to be a masterstroke of vision from you. It's like, yeah, if they did a live action Star Wars Solo TV series and they got Taika in to direct some episodes of that, or he's the Deborah Chow for that series and he does the whole damn thing, that would be a perfect marriage, because Solo always had, especially the Brian Daley Solo books, had that sort of quirky, slightly odd, left of centre feel about them. Very sort of, you know what I mean? It had that kind of touch about it.
Everybody pretty much knows that George was into his comic books and into TV serials and, Flash Gordon and stuff like that. And I think we do sometimes, as a fan base, we get so deep into kind of thinking about the minutiae of Star Wars that actually sometimes we just need to take a step back and enjoy Star Wars.
Yeah.
And for Star Wars, we have not necessarily what we didn't get or what we want to get and what we should get. And I think sometimes it's finding that balance, isn't it? Of like, you want to be able to tell a story that is enjoyable and fun for everybody in it and who's watching it, but also that moves, let's say, the galaxy along a little bit. It would be like great if they just did let's say a film set on a planet and there's just a couple of guys and there was no mention of the Force. Yeah. There was no mention of, let's say, the Empire or the destruction of the Death Stars or Luke Skywalker. And everything about it screams to you that this is set in Star Wars, but actually it says nothing about Star Wars. That would be, I think, the ultimate aim, really, would be to get something like that where actually you can have these stories which don't have to rely on callbacks or quote unquote fan service or what have you, or Easter eggs. But yet there's something about the DNA of it makes it feel like Star Wars. You could almost do like a whole film and then just right at the end just have like 2 stormtroopers that walk past, and then it's like, oh, actually we are in Star Wars.
Yeah, you could definitely do something where all the obvious trappings of Star Wars aren't there. I think in the Star Wars galaxy, however many trillion people live in the Star Wars galaxy, in my head I'm thinking they're not all flying around the galaxy and doing this. It's not like that. It's probably 95% of people in the galaxy have never left their own planet. Yeah. Like here, I would imagine most people just live their life on Corellia and just do their thing. And if they want to travel, or they've got relatives who live on Tatooine, then they'll travel to Tatooine like we travel to Australia. And it's like, I might not be here again for 10 years. And most people either can't afford it, because if you haven't got your own ship, which I can't imagine everybody in Star Wars has their own ship, they just can't, because it's so expensive not only to buy but to run. Then they're doing trips like Star Tours type trips, which is like us going on the Queen Mary or something. It's an expensive game. So travelling around the galaxy is easily accessible because every planet, or most planets, have starports. But it's not something like us hopping on a EasyJet flight to Malaga or something. It's not that simple. So most people are just living their normal lives within the Star Wars galaxy. They'd know who the Emperor was, but they wouldn't know who Luke Skywalker was. A lot of them, it's not in their wheelhouse. It's nothing to do with them. But
that's just it. I mean, like you said, I suppose if you've got a star system with a couple of habitable planets, they might hop from one to the other. But it's probably very few people, unless it's for business or something, that goes from Corellia to Coruscant, for instance. Yeah. So there's so much scope, and we're just talking about like geographically. We're not even talking about from a timeline perspective, and we haven't even gotten into like which era this series could be set in, or this film could be set in, because there's no kind of announcement, there's no plans to say anything like that now. But there's so much of that scope for that. It'll be interesting, and it's definitely a story to watch with great interest, I think.
So that's all for episode 37 of Making Tracks. If you want to be part of the action and stay updated on all the latest Star Wars news, visit fanthatracks.com or check out the Fanthatracks app through the App Store to follow us on your mobile. You can reach out to us and send in your listeners' questions by emailing radio@fanthatracks.com. And we didn't do a listener's question today, but we will have one on the next episode. Please send in any questions. If you want to hear us chat and talk and pontificate and rabbit on about stuff, send your listeners' questions in. So radio@fanthatracks.com. Comment, like and share on any of our social media feeds @Fanthatracks, and be sure to subscribe, leave a review, preferably a 5-star one, on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or your podcatcher or smart speaker of choice. Thank you again, Mark. Thank you for another wonderful episode.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me, and stay safe, my friend.
I will do my best, and we'll catch you all next time.
Coming up next on Fanthatracks Radio, it's Desert Planet Discs.